Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
Today on the show, we're closing our series on the films of Christopher Nolan with a discussion of his three original IP blockbusters. That would be the dream heist film Inception, the sci-fi epic Interstellar, and the World War II survival drama Dunkirk.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, welcome back again to our four-part series on the films of Christopher Nolan. We have reached the end of that journey. Chris Nolan, of course, has a new film in theaters soon called Tenet. It is actually opening as of this recording. It is opening in a couple days overseas in Europe and in the UK, and it will potentially be opening in American theaters in a couple weeks. I say potentially because during this strange time, it always feels like everything is tentative in some ways, you know?
Yeah, totally.
I think they're probably going to go forward with it at this point. We've sort of seen movies actually opened again last week. The Russell Crowe film Unhinged came out. This week, Disney is releasing The New Mutants. It sort of seems like the seal has been broken on movie theaters being open again in the States. Whether or not that's a good idea,
I got a box office report from a very optimistic producer on the film Unhinged. And what was interesting about that is that, they were touting the numbers and everything, but they showed the top 5 theaters in the country for box office, and the top 2 were drive-in. So people are still leaning on the drive-in. And supposedly Warner Brothers is resisting drive-ins for Tenet.
I've heard that they'll do it for areas where there's not a normal theater necessarily open, but they are being resistant, I think, about areas where you could go to where there are theaters that are open that you could show it instead, which
right.
I don't know. We don't necessarily need to derail this entire conversation to talk about that. But
yeah, before the show we were talking about just what a quagmire all of this is, and it's a very case-by-case basis kind of situation right now, I feel like.
It really is. In any case, though, Tenet will soon be in theaters, at least somewhere. So we've been doing this whole series just going back through his body of work. And we talked the first week about Memento and following his first 2 films. The second week was devoted to the Batman trilogy, the Dark Knight trilogy. And last week we talked about The Prestige and Insomnia, sort of 2 films that represent different sides of Nolan's kind of give-take relationship with movie studios. And so this week we're kind of we're finishing out Nolan's filmography with 3 very large films he made over the last decade. Basically,
large in every sense. They're long, they're expensive, they've got a lot of plot. These are just big movies in every sense of the word.
They're very big movies, and I still think it's kind of remarkable that Nolan got to the point where if you had asked me after Memento, after he broke out with Memento, what kind of filmmaker he was going to become, I don't think I would have guessed that he would one day be basically a purveyor of huge idea-driven blockbusters. But that's sort of where we're at, And
a household name, because like if you want to make movies the size of Inception or Interstellar or Dunkirk and have them be successful, the director has to be a household name.
Yeah, pretty much. And all of them were sort of it's very interesting to look at the advertising. I remember when Inception was coming out, it was very much, this is the first post Dark Knight movie from Christopher Nolan. Dark Knight had obviously been this enormous cultural event, so people were like, they were basically using Nolan's name to advertise Inception.
To sell it. Yep.
Right. And I think what's really interesting is that since all of his movies are essentially hits, you just keep you look at somebody like Antoine Fuqua, for example. Right. Antoine Fuqua for years was basically, anytime he had a new movie coming out, it was the new movie from the director of Training Day. So for 15 years, and they're he was not adding a lot of movies to that CV, at least in terms of using them as an advertising hook. But with Nolan, I feel like every time he has a new movie, it's like he adds a new one that advertisers can use to entice people to the theater. And
you
I
mean
think
you mean like when Dunkirk comes out, they say from the director of Interstellar, and they just go back to the previous film?
Exactly, yeah. I think they use a lot of his films, but I think he's actually to the point now where he's made enough big hits that they have to make choices about which ones they're going to use for those kind of advertisements,
In the marketing now, I don't think they even, The Dark Knight isn't really part of the marketing for Tenet. It's like that. that's sort of become its own thing at this point, because the films we're talking about today are also their own thing.
Totally. And I think what they all have in common is that they all represent Nolan basically taking a big swing, using the kind of he kind of got a blank check, I think, after the Batman films, and especially after studios basically looked at him and started to see him as somebody who could deliver. But I still think it's a little bit remarkable that he's managed to make these films that are, I mean, regardless of what you think of them, they are 4 blockbuster films, particularly in the 21st century, and particularly over this past decade. They are auteuristic in a lot of ways. They are all about his particular obsessions and interests. They are ambitious. They are structurally complicated. And I think that what you see with these movies is you see somebody willing to basically say, I'm going to ask the audience to come along with me on this. I'm going to ask of you to grasp some of these, at least these sort of structurally ambitious ideas that these movies have, you know?
Yeah, I mean, but, like you were talking about the marketing of the films, each one building on the last one, I think by now it's not that big of an ask, simply because the kinds of ways that he plays with structure and time are consistent, across the different movies. And so, you kind of know what you're in for at this point. And so it's not like he's asking the audience to engage with something completely new and complicated every time. It's like, this is my kind of complicated. And over time, audiences are more familiar with what that implies and what that's going to mean in terms of the story.
Totally. And I think that beyond that, I think that Nolan has built a little bit on that too, though. He said that if you can grasp what I'm doing in Inception, for example, with this sort of nesting doll structure, I think you can get what I'm doing in Dunkirk, which is even more complicated in some ways.
Yeah, Dunkirk is it's one of those movies that recalling when we talked about Memento, when you're watching it, it's not hard to follow, but then when you start reading about it, you realize, oh, that story is more complicated than I maybe even realized when I was watching it.
Yeah. I mean, if you were to map it out, I mean, you really see that it's doing a lot of pretty sophisticated things in terms of cross-cutting, because you're not just cross-cutting between stories and space, you're cross-cutting against different durations of time.
Yeah.
We'll get into that in a little bit. I think we should start by talking about Inception, though.
Sure.
And the other remarkable thing I find about this run of films from him is that it's not just that Nolan got a studio to fund movies that are in some ways very complicated. It's also that he got audiences to invest in that. And I mean, Inception was a huge hit.
Huge hit. I was looking up the numbers before the show, and Inception made $833 million worldwide. That's almost $1 billion.
And these days, that's almost unheard of for something that's an original property.
Exactly.
Inception is not based on anything. It's not a comic book adaptation. It is just this wild idea that Christopher Nolan had, and people went to it in droves. I think partially driven by the success of The Dark Knight, but also because it looked really cool, And
significantly, there has not been an Inception 2 in the next 10 years. I'm sure a studio head has floated the idea to Christopher Nolan before, but significantly, these films were not franchise starters. A lot of times when you have an original, IP idea like this, they end up getting launched into franchises, but that hasn't been the case with Nolan.
That's very true. He's resisted that with both Inception and Interstellar, which I think both could theoretically be franchises. I mean, there was even some rumors going around when the Tenet trailer dropped that Tenet was like a stealth Inception sequel.
Oh, M. Night Shyamalan style, huh?
Yeah. I haven't been reading the reviews. It's possible that that's true. I suspect that if that were true, however, that probably would have gotten to me by now. I kind of doubt it's an Inception sequel, but
I mean, you don't know. Maybe people, sometimes they ask people to keep certain things out of their reviews. Sometimes that's part of the conditions to going to the screening, is that you don't mention certain things.
That's true. The particular M. Night Shyamalan movie you were talking about, I don't feel like people were spoiling willy-nilly that film's connection to another movie and his filmography.
Yeah, because I went to a preview screening of that was a surprise screening. It was truly surprising. And there was we had to sign a form saying that we weren't going to reveal X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Katie, last week when we were talking about The Prestige, I was saying I felt like The Prestige was sort of the quintessential Christopher Nolan film. But you think that that's Inception. Why is
I
that?
think Inception is the Christopher Nolan film because it incorporates the reason you said The Prestige, as I recall, is that it's just got a lot of his personal fixations and storytelling styles and things like that. I think all those themes are also present in Inception, but it also it bridges this current phase of his career where they're huge blockbuster films, in the original blockbuster idea. And also, it's got, and the aesthetics of Inception are very Christopher Nolan to me, more so than The Prestige, because The Prestige has that period setting, whereas Inception has the sort of like tailored suits, overcast, gunmetal gray sky kind of look that I think of as the Christopher Nolan aesthetic.
Also, lots of close-ups on hands. Water is a major theme in the film. He loves water. I wonder if he's afraid of water. Because a lot of people seem to die from water in his films,
That's true.
Yeah.
I have to ask him. Maybe he'll... Yeah.
So the film's premise, for those who do not know, I imagine most of our readers will know the premise of Inception at this point, but the film's premise is that it takes place in a world where there is a technology that allows you to enter people's dreams. And most people use it to steal secrets, basically. They will go into people's dreams and try to extract some valuable piece of information from them. It's like corporate espionage, basically. Yeah,
it seems to be mostly used for business purposes to, find out what your rivals are working on, kind of thing.
Exactly, yep. And Inception sort of hinges on somebody sort of pulling I love this idea, too, that you introduce this really outlandish idea. People are going to people's heads and stealing things, and then immediately subvert it by saying, no, this time they're going into their heads and planting something there.
To plant things in there, which is...
It's like, wait a minute, I just got my head around the idea that people are stealing things from people's heads.
Well, buckle up, because planting things in people's heads is extra risky.
Yeah. Can I say, this movie, too, has some very weird ideas about the mind. So there's like a couple moments in it. I was watching it again like last week or something, and one of the ideas is that somebody says that they're like these declarative sentences that people make about the mind that are meant as kind of they're sort of expositional in a way. They're like explaining the rules of the world. But at one point during his like pitch to Ken Watanabe, Leonardo DiCaprio's character named Cobb, he sort of he says that once you have an idea, it's impossible to get rid of it.
Yeah, this movie doesn't really engage with I would say humanity as a biological entity. Like, the mind is a very abstract thing. It's not, it's not a brain with synapses firing in this movie. It's a wholly abstract concept, the mind.
And I just feel like it's ideas about thinking and about the mind. Some of them are a little confused. There's another moment when Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, he plays so DiCaprio plays, he's sort of an expert in the field of mind theft, one might say, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt is like his second in command. He like regularly goes on these jobs with him, and he says at one point, once somebody gives you an idea, you know that you got it from somewhere else. And I'm just thinking, like, that's not true.
How do you know that? Yeah,
that's not true. I mean, we internalize other people's ideas all the time. Like,
sure.
You will think. I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I've been writing a review before, and I've written an idea, and then I've thought, wait a minute.
Did I come up with that?
Wait, yeah. I think maybe I read that somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think people do that all the time.
I think people do that all the time too. And what jumps into my mind is sometimes you'll quote a movie or something and not even realize that you're quoting something.
Yeah, totally.
It's become integrated into your brain.
That's bullshit, Nolan.
I don't think he's especially concerned with, certainly not realism, but also just like it has its own internal rules, and that's all it really cares about. It's not really engaged with anybody else's ideas of the mind and how it works or anything like that. Certainly stand alone in that way.
It has a lot of rules too. I mean,
there are.
Ellen Page plays this character who becomes. We should say the plot ends up revolving around DiCaprio's character named Cobb, who does this professionally, is basically hired to go into someone's head, to a character played by Cillian Murphy, to go into his head and plant an idea. It's a big corporate espionage scheme. His rival, his sort of corporate rival, wants him to dissolve his father's company, and so DiCaprio basically has to put together this team. I mean, it's basically a heist movie. I mean, it's like Ocean's 11 or something, where DiCaprio goes and finds a character played by Tom Hardy is going to help him out, and he goes and sees Ellen Page plays this student who is going to. She works as an engineer. It's her job to kind of to build the world.
Yeah, she's the architect who designs it, and it's all based on mazes.
Yeah, totally. And she's a purely expositional character, I would say.
Oh, purely, 100%. I'm not entirely sure why she has to go in there with them. I still don't quite understand that. Why they all have to go, I don't quite know. But that's the plot of the movie. But speaking of this being a very self-contained thing that's really only concerned with its own inner workings, like you were saying, this is a corporate espionage thriller. The stakes, you really have to read between the lines to have the future of humanity hanging in the balance of this situation.
Yeah, because it's basically just two corporate barons sort of sniping at each other, and one of them trying to undermine his corporate rival.
Right, and all the tension and all the suspense is internal, because the thing you're worried about is the fate of all these people inside the dream and if they're going to be able to get out.
Yeah, I mean, there are some life and death stakes within the dream, which again the movie has to explain in great detail, because it even starts breaking its own rules. I mean, early in the film, they suggest that if you die in a dream, you just wake up. But then the movie has to say, no, if you're going deeper into the layers of the dream, if you die, you will fall into the subconscious or something. So it's like not only establishing rules, it's like compounding them and changing them as it goes,
Yeah, no, it definitely does do that. There's a lot of I know I told you that last time, but I was either lying or this is different. There's a lot of that going on. Yeah.
I remember thinking when I first saw Inception that for a movie about dreams, it actually is awfully literal in some ways. I mean, which I think is partially the point. I mean, one of the things is in order for them to be able to navigate somebody's mind, they have to make the dream space rational in some ways. But so I think that makes sense. At the same time, I watch it and I think what somebody who actually had an interest in something like dream logic might do with this. There's a scene where DiCaprio says to Ellen Page, when he's sort of pitching her on becoming part of the team, he says, "It's your chance to build cathedrals, entire cities, things that never existed in the real world." We see none of that. She basically creates a city, a hotel, and the third layer of the dream, which it basically is like a bad level of the N64 James Bond GoldenEye game.
I was gonna say it's like a James Bond villain lair. Yeah. I mean, I suppose there is some of that in. This is an idea in the film that I think is interesting, and I do actually wish they had developed a little more. Was sort of like the MC Escher logic of things turning in on themselves.
Yeah.
They show it visually in some kind of splashy scenes, but they don't, especially in terms of Ellen Page's character, they don't really flesh that out so much. It's just something that's presented as neat.
Yeah, they don't use it much at all. I mean, it almost feels like Nolan giving us some money shots because he knows that we'll want to see some cool stuff like that in a movie about dreams. Because I think he's mostly not interested in the reality bending capabilities of dreams. I mean, the movie in some respects is a heist movie, and it's interested in its internal logic, and it's interested in the possibility in what it's doing with time. I think one of the through lines of Nolan's whole filmography is that he is very interested in time and relativity.
Yes.
And there's a lot of that. I mean, I think that in so much as Inception works, I think it's very clever about how it basically is nesting these different worlds into each other. There's a lot of fun in that, Yeah,
it's not necessarily a negative thing that the movie builds so much of a world that even in a 2-hour and 28-minute runtime, it's not able to explore every corner of the world. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Sure, of course. That's actually one case maybe for why this thing could probably sustain a sequel if he wanted to make one, There's just so much more you could do. I would just love to see somebody like David Lynch play with this premise. Somebody who
he does. He just everything he does is dream logic. That's his whole deal.
It's like the same thought I have when I'm watching a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which is that this does not feel enough like like a dream. And again, in Inception, they do play with that idea. They say that to their marks, it isn't supposed to feel like a dream. It's supposed to feel as close to reality as possible. I can't help but look at this thing and think, man, I wish they played with the endless possibilities of like dream logic a little bit more.
Yeah, they do. Well, most of the cool stuff they do is, more physics. Like there's a whole sequence where in one of the levels, in the top level, they're falling off of a bridge. And so in the level below that, there's no gravity. And the way that, the sort of imaginary physics of it does some kind of interesting stuff.
And that's a phenomenal sequence, too. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that this Inception, one of the things Inception did was I think it started to establish that that Nolan could really handle this level of spectacle. I had my doubts on that for a while, honestly. I mean, I think when we talked about the Batman films, we talked about how he made a fairly smooth transition into that level of filmmaking.
Yeah.
But I still felt largely that a lot of his films, occasionally with the action sequences, felt a little like spatially incoherent occasionally.
I agree. Yeah, especially in Batman Begins, you see some of that where it's like he took to spending the money immediately. But staging the big epic sequences took a little bit longer.
Exactly. But I do think this one actually has some really great sequences in it, and I think the fight in the hallway with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, where he's like fighting goons and there's no gravity, I think is there's a reason that I think that is when a lot of people think of Inception, I think that's the scene they think of. And I think that has been a little influential.
Oh, totally. I think that sequence has definitely been influential. And actually, my favorite thing about that sequence is how everybody else is sleeping, and he wraps like, I don't know what it is, like electrical cords around them, and has this whole complicated plan with an elevator to try to jolt them awake without there being any gravity. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I do love that stuff. Definitely.
Yeah, that part's pretty cool.
Am I crazy to think that this could also be last week I was talking about how I thought that Prestige might be a metaphor for cinema and for the arrival of cinema, and am I crazy for thinking that this whole thing might be a bit of a metaphor for filmmaking too? He's putting together this team, this team to pull this heist, but I mean, a lot of them are serving the functions that somebody might serve on a production, on a film production. I mean, they're building worlds. I mean, Hardy's character at one point is literally playing another person. He's basically an actor within this world. There's that whole sequence where he has to fool Cillian Murphy to think that he's talking to his business associate. So you have an actor within the world. You have people who are basically scripting this reality. And if you think about, if you wanted to, again, this might be me reaching a little bit, but I do think that if you wanted to think of this as a metaphor for filmmaking, what is Nolan saying? That we use our art, we use films to put ideas in people's heads, to change the way that people think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm
the
gonna
dark
be
side
honest.
of that. Okay.
Sure. I'm gonna be honest. This thought had not occurred to me before because, like you were saying before, this film is so literal about its concept that I didn't really think about it in those sort of terms at all. Honestly, I think about this film more as like you remember the game Mousetrap, where there's that long. Yeah. It's like a game of Mousetrap where he drops the ball and then the whole movie rolls through, and it's so single-minded in its.
It's like a Rube Goldberg device almost.
Yeah. Only a Rube Goldberg device is inherently pointless, and this one is more like I think it does have an end goal in mind.
It does. Let me ask you this: does this movie get to you on any sort of emotional level?
No, it's just cool. You're just like, that's cool. I saw this movie in 70 millimeter at the Music Box, and it's quite a spectacle when you see it in 70 millimeter.
I bet it looks great. I'm jealous. I do think that it wants to have an emotional kick of some sort. The whole thing is built around. So DiCaprio's character Cobb has, like many Nolan protagonists, has lost a wife. He has a dead wife, and. The film is kind of built around his feelings of regret about that, and his wife, played by Marion Cotillard, appears to him as a projection in his mind. And I think that we are meant to... all that stuff about him and his wife, I think, is supposed to be the kind of emotional core of this thing.
Yeah, I agree, but it doesn't really do much for me, to be honest with you. Number one, because it's kind of an old saw. even within Nolan's filmography of the dead wife, it's a trope anyway, and it's a trope for him in particular. And so for me, it just doesn't resonate as much. And also, the film gets a little convoluted when they start really unraveling the mechanics of that situation to me. And so it doesn't really do a lot for me emotionally, no.
Yeah, I think my issue is that we get no real sense of the relationship between Cobb and his wife.
Right, right.
It's not like she's a character. I mean, even when we're seeing her in memories as opposed to the projection version of her, she's not a character, and because it's just a concept, like almost everything else in Inception. Inception is like... Yeah. It's like a cool contraption of a film is the way that I think about it.
Exactly.
I'm constantly sort of admiring its moving parts and impressed by that it even exists. I mean, the fact that a studio gave Nolan as much money as they did to make this thing is impressive to me. It just doesn't speak to me on any sort of real emotional or thematic level.
Yeah, I would say that emotionally this movie is pretty chilly. I agree. I also think of it as like a fantastic device that you go, ooh, as it twists and turns and everything. But it doesn't, I wouldn't say that it doesn't stick with you, but I just don't think that I don't think that it is all that moving emotionally.
It's like a magic trick, the way that he described, the way in The Prestige. You talk about a magic trick. That's kind of what he's doing with Inception. It's actually one of I don't want to say my least favorite. It's not one of my favorite Nolans but I am sort of impressed with its existence. No,
I like this movie. I think it is the quintessential Christopher Nolan movie for the reasons that I said. And I mean, honestly, I think I would rather have a movie that is just like flashy and neat and cool, and the emotional stuff is kind of secondary. Because if he had really foregrounded that relationship and it didn't ring true, then that could have sunk the movie, I think.
Yeah.
And
that's true.
I don't really mind I don't mind a fireworks show.
Yeah. Well, and I've defended Nolan on this very podcast from charges that he's a filmmaker who has no passion, that there's no humanity in his films, because I think there is quite a lot of that, and that feels like a pretty good segue into talking about Interstellar.
Yes, definitely plays the emotional angle more. So something that I read about Interstellar that made the movie make a lot more sense to me is that this was originally a Steven Spielberg project.
Wow, that makes so much sense.
Doesn't that make so much sense?
It does, yeah.
Because the first half hour is a Spielberg movie.
I mean, a lot of it, I think, is Spielberg.
Yeah.
I mean, so people, when this came out in 2014, now he had made, at that point, he did Inception in 2010. The final Batman movie came out in 2012. And then afterwards was Interstellar in 2014. And
honestly, every 2 years is a really good clip for gigantic projects like this.
It is.
It's quick work.
even like to conceptually figure these films out, I can't imagine how fast he does that. But so when the movie came out, I feel like people were straining to compare it to Kubrick and to Tarkovsky, and I looked at it and I thought, I see a lot of Spielberg in this thing, and I also see, honestly, and this is not an insult, I will say, because I do not consider this an insult, I think there's a fair amount of Shyamalan in it too, actually.
Oh, okay.
In its kind of gooiness and its sort of new age, there's a kind of new age spirituality to it. Even
there is a little bit, yeah, because they keep talking about they. There's this mysterious they, and they don't really make clear if it's aliens or God or what. It's left open-ended on purpose, I think.
Right. I mean, though the film is steeped in some real science, and I think there is an aspect of this that is hard science. I think his interest in relativity, which is one of the most fascinating things about the film, is very science fiction.
I agree. It's my favorite thing about the movie is the relativity stuff.
Isn't that stuff fascinating?
It's interesting, and it fits in for a filmmaker who's got a lot of skill with playing with time. It works really well. That's my I think I like that more than the emotional part again.
Yeah. Well, but I think it feeds into the emotional part too, because I mean, so I feel like we should at least lay out what this movie is.
Yes, we'll backtrack a little bit.
Matthew McConaughey plays basically this former pilot who we're in this world. Basically, we're in a very dystopian version of the world and of the United States.
It's 2067, I believe. Yeah, it's the year 2067, and there's a new Dust Bowl on.
Totally. Environmentally, we're fucked, basically. So it's actually probably pretty similar to what 2067 might really look like, actually.
Yeah, that's my other favorite thing about this movie is the eco element.
Yeah, totally. And so he is working as a farmer now. Most people in America are now working as a farmer because there's a huge shortage of food, and they basically need people to be feeding the country. But he, with the help of his daughter and some metaphysical stuff that the movie eventually explains, he stumbles upon, I actually really love this idea too. I think it's really fun and nerdy, but he stumbles upon the remnants of NASA. And NASA is basically operating at this point underground.
Yeah,
it's
NASA
almost like
is
Ghost
the
Protocol.
Justice League in this movie.
Yeah. Well,
NASA's
I thought of
totally
like
the Justice League.
I thought of like when in a Mission Impossible movie when they have to like disavow, basically. They're
Yeah.
almost like working like off the grid. They're, like,
Yeah, totally.
underground
Yeah,
and stuff, you know?
Like it's a secret base.
Yeah. So they have decided that they need a backup because Earth might not make it. So they have found a way. They have basically found through a wormhole a way to go to another galaxy. And there are a bunch of potential planets on the other side of this galaxy. They've sent expeditions out there, which I will say this. Can I mention this too?
Yeah.
It's weird to me that they would send one person to each of the planets, I have to say. Why would you not get a team? You really don't have people who would be willing to go? I don't know.
I mean, it's true. They're not little tiny pods or anything. You know, I mean, the reason they sent people up in space by themselves at first is because they just had those little teeny tiny little, throwing metal balls into space. But yeah. They have full-size ships.
They have ships. They could send
Yeah.
more people. I mean, I think that partially the idea is that it's presented as it's kind of a suicide mission because there are 3 different planets in this galaxy. And they're basically rolling the dice and hoping that one of them will be hospitable and that maybe human life can continue on one of these planets. So the bulk of the film is Cooper, again played by Matthew McConaughey, leading this team on this ship to go find out what happened to those other teams and if any of the planets are hospitable.
Yeah, and some of them seem promising, but there's maybe those data's unreliable. I don't know.
Yeah. There's this brilliant sequence early on in the film, though. This is, by the way, a very long film. I think that it is Nolan's longest.
About
if I'm not
3
mistaken.
hours. Yeah,
It's just shy of 3 hours.
It's epic too. It's several movies put together.
It is.
You mentioned. I think this movie is it starts off as a Spielberg film and then it gradually turns into a Kubrick film. Like it hybrids with a Kubrick film as it goes on. That's
so sort of like AI, one might say.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, totally.
Just with the equation reversed, maybe.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I remember feeling kind of overwhelmed by it on first viewing, and I think part of that is that the mix, at least in a movie theater, this is me again saying that Interstellar is a movie that was obviously made to be seen on a giant screen, and yet I watch it now and I feel I'm able to key into elements of it that I think I was kind of missing because on the big screen it is an overwhelming experience. It's loud as shit. It is such a loud movie. It's one of his loudest. And there's just so many different components to it in terms of what it's trying to do. I mean, each planet is almost like its own movie.
It is.
But the sequence I was referring to, the one that I think is kind of I think it's the best scene in the movie, and I think it's the one that really, if you wanted to make the case for Nolan as a filmmaker who is genuinely interested in human emotion, I think you would cite this one, and it actually builds straight out of the relativity angle, which is they go to that planet that, by the way, standard spoiler warning that we've been giving every episode. We're going to talk about the details of these films.
Right.
So if you haven't seen the movie,
we won't say how it ends, but
yeah, exactly.
You're going to get a little bit of detail.
So the first planet they go to is this one that is basically covered in water, and it's impossible for them probably to set up shop there. They go down to the surface, but it's established before they go down that something like every hour on the surface of the planet is like 7 years because of relativity and gravity. And when they return to the ship, things do not go great on the planet, and when they return to the ship, 23 years in Earth time has passed.
Yeah.
So you get this scene of McConaughey sitting down and watching messages from his children as the years pass, and for him it's been a few hours, for them it's been like almost 25 years. And
he watches them kind of give up on his he watches him give up hope that he's still alive, like in real time in these messages.
In real time. It's brutal. Like it is. I think you have to be as much of a robot as the robot on board TARS to not feel something about that scene.
I enjoy TARS, by the way. I
really like him.
TARS belongs in the pantheon of great movie robots, I think. I really like TARS.
For one thing, it's really unintuitive the way that they've constructed him. I mean, I feel like I'd never seen a robot quite like that before, know? The one that's just constructed with almost these pillars that can move around. But I really like his personality, too.
I do, too,
There's this running gag about Cooper constantly taking his jokes, like his humor settings down, because they're at like 100% at the start, and he's like making these sort of, he has this sort of gallows humor, and he just keeps dipping the humor down in percentage.
Which is very funny because no one ever accused Christopher Nolan of being a cut-up, so
exactly.
It's kind of funny that that's an element in the film.
But to me, in some ways, Interstellar does feel like him reconciling the part of him, the kind of chilly intellectual side of his filmmaking with a very real but often unacknowledged emotional aspect to his films. Like the movie feels like a reconciliation between those to me, because it is in some respects trying to operate as a hard sci-fi movie, but it's also, as you said, kind of a gooey Spielberg movie too.
I mentioned Spielberg. So originally this concept for Interstellar was conceived by the team that did Contact back in 1997, and they started working on the concept, and then Steven Spielberg was attached to direct, and then like studio stuff. Spielberg DreamWorks moved over to a different studio, and so they brought Jonathan Nolan on to develop the script, and eventually Christopher Nolan came on board too, and Nolan spent many years on this script. You said something about just grappling with the concepts, something, looking into like the development of the movie, something that I've noticed is a lot of these ideas he had for a while before he actually got the chance to make the movie. Inception was the same way. He had the idea back during the insomnia days. He had written a treatment back in around the time of Insomnia, but didn't make the movie until later. And so that may, they're not pulling it out of their ass. These are all ideas they work on for a really long time before they actually execute them.
And maybe that's the reality. But I mean, we were discussing a few minutes ago this idea that it's kind of amazing that he for a little bit there was making one of these every 2 years. But in reality, the gestation process for these films is a lot longer.
Exactly.
Something like Interstellar reaches back many years, which makes sense because I think to write this script, you would need some time.
Oh, absolutely. Just because of, like you were saying, the hard sci-fi elements and the way that it, I think it does a really good job of conveying the concept of relativity in a in a narrative way. They don't over-intellectualize it, but you understand the concept.
Totally. So how do you fall? Where do you fall on this one now?
I like it pretty well. I like it better. I think I like Inception a little better than Interstellar. And the thing about Interstellar is I was watching the movie and the whole time I was going, yeah, this is good. I dig it. I get it. I really I love all the sort of big epic flight through space kind of stuff. Whenever they have those big sequences in space, there's one where they fly, they pilot the ship into a black hole. Like, that stuff is awesome. That stuff's really cool. But I think overall, if I'm looking for a film about like sad dads in space, I'm gonna have to go with Ad Astra. I like Ad Astra. I prefer that film, I think.
I think I might too, although I think they're different in a lot of ways.
They are.
This one, it kind of clicked for me a little bit more on second viewing. I remember thinking at the time, I think I said earlier that I remember feeling like this thing just kind of overwhelmed me a little bit.
Yeah.
There are aspects of it.
I could see that. I did not see this in the theater. I've only seen it at home, so.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I saw it. I saw it not just on the theater, but on an IMAX screen.
Woo!
And I felt bombarded by it a little bit.
Yeah, no kidding.
I think, but as with the film he made immediately before, The Dark Knight Rises, I think it benefits from repeat viewings and from seeing aspects of it that kind of maybe get a little overshadowed and obliterated by just the pure scope of it. What kind of clicked for me this time watching it is that I think the whole film is really about squaring your own wants and needs and interests against like a greater goods, basically. And that plays across that plays out across the arcs of multiple characters in this film. I mean, Cooper Christopher's decision fundamentally to leave his family and go to space, I mean, that's the emotional arc of the film, and it's all about him saying basically, I have to be a bad father in order to be a good human in this case.
Yeah, and this is a plot point. It's not a huge spoiler, but that's also there. It also shows up in the film in a couple different places like that. There's Anne Hathaway's character, she's a scientist who's also on this flight. Her father is Michael Caine, who's spearheading the whole project, and she leaves her father behind to go out to space. And part of the plan is, they call this Plan A, the idea of finding another planet for humanity to live on, and then flying everybody there to, moving the population of Earth to this place. But they also have Plan B, which is if they don't think they're going to be able to make it back, they have a bunch of fertilized embryos on board to start humanity over somewhere else.
Yep. That's right. Most of the characters in this film have an element of pragmatism to them. But even Hathaway, we find out at some point in the film, her character has feelings for one of the scientists that went to the planet. So the question of even where they go, like which planet they go to, is complicated by these human relatable feelings she has. And eventually Matt Damon shows up, and I don't want to say too much about that because we're approaching later in the film, but I will say that Matt Damon's whole character arc in this film comes down to this battle between self-interest and the greater good.
Yeah.
It plays out in a different way.
Even the Nolan films that, maybe might not work for you, like emotionally, they might not move you. This one doesn't really move me that much either, frankly, but they're always very well developed thematically. Dude loves to develop a theme, and he's good at it, and I'll give him credit for that.
I would agree, yeah. I liked this a lot more on second viewing than I did before. And there were even things that I found kind of silly the first time around that I found less silly this time. There's a moment early on in the film where it's revealed that the U.S. has started, basically the official line of the U.S. is that the NASA landing was faked, and that's what they're teaching in schools. And I remember seeing it in theaters and being like, that's ridiculous. People wouldn't believe that after all these years. But now, honestly, 6 years later, I think there is a very specific portion of the country that if the right person told them that was true, they would believe it immediately. They would believe
it. Yeah, totally. I guess I just feel like this movie's so big and so epic, and it has so many big ideas and big sequences, and it's just so big that the human part of it feels a little small to me. It doesn't like it. That part gets overshadowed by the sheer scope of the thing.
That makes sense. Now, Dunkirk, in its own way, is a big film. I mean, it's it's an elaborate production in a lot of ways. It
was relatively thrifty for Christopher Nolan. Inception and Interstellar both had a budget of $160 million. This one, they cut corners. It was only $100 million budget.
Well, but in today's day and age, that actually is. I mean, the sad truth is we talk a lot about it.
It's fairly standard for a big blockbuster movie, isn't it?
I think it's actually a little lower than what a standard blockbuster normally costs, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think $100 million is now considered economical in terms of what Hollywood likes to spend on these kind of movies. But in other respects, it's a smaller film, I think, than at least the few that he made before it. I mean, it's his shortest since Following.
Yeah. No, I actually, when I went to rewatch this one, I actually double checked the running time because I said, that can't be right. Less than 2 hours. What?
No, it is. Yeah. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the film is interested in sort of seeing the human scale in this big historical event. I mean, it keeps us very locked into a decidedly human perspective on this story.
Yeah, and like ground level, it does take it down to individual, like it's this giant battle. The number they say there's like 300,000 soldiers stranded or something like that. But really, I mean, even with the multiple plots, there's no more than a dozen, speaking part characters. There really aren't that many.
There aren't many, no.
Yeah, even with there being 3 different periods of time going on.
Yeah.
Explain that. It's a little. It's like I said up top, it's deceptively complex because it's not hard to follow, but then you're like, oh, wow, a lot went into this. There's a lot going on. Anyway.
I think it's pretty complicated in some ways.
It is.
I mean, so the film is dramatizing this sort of major historical event in, it's become kind of a cornerstone of, one could say, like British national identity. And it is during World War II, the evacuation of Dunkirk, the beaches of France, basically. The German soldiers had forced a number of Allied troops from France and Britain and Belgium to retreat to the beaches, basically, and where they were essentially sitting ducks. And the evacuation of Dunkirk, what basically happened was in the sort of the last week of May and first week of June, a number of civilian sea crafts and ships sort of came to and rescued these soldiers that were stranded on the beach.
And crossed
thousands
the British
of Allied troops.
Crossed
Channel.
the channel, and I've never seen the channel in real life. I know that swimming across it is possible but very difficult. Do you know how long of a boat ride it is? Is it a?
I don't know that exactly.
It's not a long. It's not a terribly long one. Yeah, the movie makes it seem like because one of the perspectives is a little tiny skipper boat, and it makes it seem like that it's going to be a huge deal for this thing to cross the channel.
Yeah, well, I think only in the sense that it's dangerous. I think the actual amount of time that it's taking is not that long. I mean, there's even a line in the movie where one of the superior officers basically says, we have men who are like going out there to swim because they can literally see if they kind of strain their eyes, they can literally, you feel like you can almost even see Britain from the beach.
You'll have people swim the English Channel, but yeah, it's supposed to be like a feat.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, have you ever been in like Lake Michigan or something, and you feel you can see the land across the way, and you think I could swim to that, and you get a little further out, and then you're like, oh no, I have to turn back. This is very.
I definitely
bad idea.
Can't do this. Yeah,
I'm gonna drown. But
I grew up by rivers, so I don't have that experience.
Different experience.
We could see right across the Ohio River, but
got it. But
I have swam in Lake Michigan as an adult, and it's a little freaky. Like you get out there and you're like, oh, wow, this is a big lake.
It's a big body of water for sure.
Yeah.
So the film sort of looks at that very famous historical event, the evacuation, through three different perspectives. And so you recently, when we were talking about Memento, you described Memento as, you said it's like you're reading a book, but you read the chapters in reverse chronological order. So you start with chapter 28, and then you read chapter 27, and then you read chapter 26.
Right.
Dunkirk is doing something somewhat similar, and I think you can kind of use a metaphor to describe what it's doing as well. I'm going to borrow from Mike D'Angelo, one of our regular contributors to the film section, and he wrote about, when he was writing about Dunkirk for our Best of 2017 coverage, he wrote that watching it is like simultaneously reading a novel, a chapter, and a sentence that are all converging on the same single word. So the idea is that they're cross-cutting not just among three different subplots, but those three different subplots are unfolding over different durations of time.
Right.
We get two soldiers that are trying to get off the beach, or basically trying to escape, and their storyline unfolds over maybe a week.
It's a week. It's like a week, a day, and an hour.
Exactly. Yeah. So the other one is we have a civilian sailboat that is crossing the channel to Dunkirk to help evacuate the soldiers, and that's a trip that takes them about a day. And we get Tom Hardy, who is in an airplane with a typically muffled Tom Hardy voice, always putting Tom Hardy in a mask, Too
handsome.
Too handsome, yeah. So he's in an airplane. He's providing sort of aerial support for the soldiers on the beach, and his particular storyline plays out over a single hour. Now, obviously, eventually these things are converging, these three different stories. So we're seeing the week play out, we're seeing the day play out, and we're seeing the hour play out. Eventually, they will all be playing out simultaneously. What I find kind of remarkable is not just that Nolan keeps this coherent, but that he has fun revealing certain things through that structure. I mean, like, for
Yeah.
example, Cillian Murphy, who is obviously he's a regular in Nolan's filmography.
It's him and Hardy are the two regulars in this one, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But Murphy plays a soldier who, during that second part of the film, who the British civilians find basically in the water, and he's been traumatized by what he's experienced. They bring him aboard. He's shell-shocked, and we don't find out until a little bit later, even though this takes place chronologically before them finding him. We don't find out later what happened to him when we meet him during the course of the week that we're seeing playing out.
Yeah.
So it's very sophisticated, I think, chronologically what they're doing, but it's never hard to follow.
Right. Yeah. So it's easy enough to follow that it's possible that you could see the movie and like not realize until afterwards what it's up to in terms of that time, because there are things that you notice like that, like finding out the backstory for Cillian Murphy's character later after they pick him up. But it's relatively subtle, I think. I don't think this movie is quite as showy with its time tricks as, say, The Prestige or Inception.
No, and I think that mostly he's using them to express the idea that that something like the evacuation of Dunkirk or war in general is a number of small moving parts with people who are experiencing it in different ways. Essentially.
Well, so it's a human version of the contraptions that his films are that we're always talking about.
Totally, and I actually think it does have. In some ways, it's a film of contradictions, because I do think that in some ways this is one of his most streamlined and his most action-driven and his least character-driven films.
Right.
I think that it really. I mean, I almost would say this thing could work as a silent movie, but then you would lose the amazing sound design. Yeah. I think it could potentially
music
work.
Is so cool too.
Oh, the music is that sort of ticking. That he's sort of almost incorporating a ticking clock into the score.
Yeah, I really like the score of this movie a lot.
Yeah. But I think in general it could work almost wordlessly, because what we're essentially seeing is a series of little survival dilemmas that are all sort of interlocked. I mean, the movie's like one after another. I remember Nolan talking about, during the production of film, talking about how he asked the people, his crew and people involved in the film, to watch The Wages of Fear, that classic of French cinema, and that is a film that is very much about a series of suspenseful dilemmas that have to do with space and with machinery, and I think there's a lot of that in Dunkirk as well. At the same time, I do think that this one has it's something about the way that I think he's speaking to the kind of universal fear that these characters are feeling. I think this thing does have a really strong human dimension as well.
Yeah, and I think that kind of is related to what you were saying about a war being made up of all these individual human dilemmas, life or death situations. And this film does do a good job of taking that from the macro to the micro to the macro over the course of the different storylines.
Totally. And I think when he ties it together at the end, when we sort of get that Churchill speech that one of them is reading off of a newspaper, and you realize that the film has been kind of a tribute to the sacrifice of these soldiers and this notion that survival in war is its own virtue, just living.
Yeah, and sort of the resilience of the British people and the strength of it's very there's a lot of pride in England in this movie.
It chokes me up a little bit, honestly, at the end, even though I have no real connection to British culture or anything, not a very explicit one or anything.
Right.
I find the way that he puts a bow on this film, and the way that this sort of 11th hour unifying around the emotions and the dramas of this situation, because throughout it plays, it basically is like it's a suspense contraption in a lot of ways. Right. But I think he very smartly... But I agree with you,
it's more human. I agree with you that it's way more human than Inception, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Even though there are, you could argue that the characters in Inception are more well-rounded than the nameless ones we meet in Dunkirk.
Sure, but I guess that their circumstances gives them, like, the dire nature of the circumstances is sort of a shortcut to emotional depth, I guess, in this situation.
And I think also it has to do with the fact, I think a lot of war movies want to immerse you in the headspace of the soldiers, but I don't think there's a lot that make you feel the urgency and the stress of the situation quite like this one does.
Yeah, as opposed to the visceral fear. Although there are a few shots in it, like there's a shot towards the beginning of the film where there's a soldier laying on the beach and you see a bunch of bodies, and then bombs start dropping from above. The Germans are dropping bombs on the beach where all the soldiers are, and you see, and there's like this one shot that it got me strangely. Where, you know, the camera's focus, the focus is on the soldier in the front, but behind him there's all these bodies laying on the beach, and then these bombs drop, and then the bodies aren't there anymore. And there was something about that I found really, like, I just mean that it was visceral, I guess. It was like a visceral moment of, just the reality of a person being there, and then a second later they're not there anymore,
and then being gone. Just totally eradicated.
Totally eradicated, right? Not even their bodies laying there; they're in pieces all over the place. Just even their body doesn't exist anymore. Like,
right.
It got under my skin a little bit. I don't know. I was like, that's a cool shot. That's fucked up though.
I mean, there are tons of little moments of horror in this thing that are sort of imprinted on my brain. There's one moment that I talk about sound design. There's one moment when a ship is basically it's basically been pushed, so it's leaning against the dock, and you hear somebody screaming down below, and you realize that somebody is being crushed between the ship and the dock. Ooh. And we don't see the person, we just hear it, and it's there's a lot of horror in that.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's interesting because there is a lot of horror. Like, I would love to see Christopher Nolan tackle the horror genre proper, because he does have, there's like elements of some of his films that are scary, and like you said, there's like in this one there's a little moments like that. I'd be curious to see what he did with, make a what's it out of a horror movie. I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I have no idea what a Christopher Nolan, like a bona fide horror movie from him would look like,
Yeah, I can't even picture it.
Be interesting.
Even though he does sci-fi, which is, they're cousins.
Yeah,
even
they are.
So. I have no idea what that would look like.
Well, I think Dunkirk does suggest that he could at least instill a feeling of stress or paranoia in us. Yeah,
definitely stress or paranoia, and definitely activate the fight or flight instinct.
I think rewatching Dunkirk, I think that this is his most accomplished piece of filmmaking, I will say. It's not necessarily my favorite Nolan film, but it's up there, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, we've talked over the last few weeks about him evolving as a visual storyteller. Right. I think this one is somebody who is so confident in the way that he is filming action, and so confident with his editing, and I think this whole thing is a testament to his ability, his growing abilities as somebody who can orchestrate this kind of large-scale spectacle.
Yeah, so now we've reached the end of the road. We haven't been able to see Tenet yet, so we can't discuss that on the podcast just yet. But so that's it. That's our 4-part series on Christopher Nolan. Yay! But so I'm curious, Dowd, when we went into this, when we first talked about doing this series, I knew you were a fan of Christopher Nolan, and you talked with a lot of passion about his movies on this podcast. And I just wonder if revisiting them like this, back to back, and diving into them and discussing them, if it enhanced your appreciation or changed it in any way for his work.
Well, I actually think all of his movies, in some respect, kind of improved for me, to be honest. The only one that I watched and thought that I might actually have had a diminished opinion of might have been Batman Begins. But I think that's partially because I had not seen that in years, and it looks like such a dry run to the other two Batman films in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, I think I gained a new appreciation. I mean, I'm going to repeat myself again because we're hitting a lot of these same points again as we go through this whole series and we talk about different films. But
sure,
I think I really that sort of prevailing negative notion about his work that it has no emotional, dramatic impact, that it's all just clever for clever's sake, and that he makes these icy exercises. I just rewatching these films really solidified in my mind that I don't think that's true, and that I think that I do think that a lot of his films are about trying to reconcile his kind of cerebral interests in things like time and a human story. And he's not always successful. Again, I think Inception is the prime example of him not really finding a way to make this clockwork contraption into something that we care about in any kind of human or emotional way.
Yeah.
But a lot of them have improved for me in that particular regard, including something like Interstellar, which I think wears its emotions on its sleeve. But when I figured out what I thought the film is really about, it really clicked for me in that way. So yeah, I don't know. I think I maybe walked away from this rewatch with a greater appreciation of his work. How about you?
Cool. I would say, I think the point you made about the criticism, I would agree with that, because I think people are kind of conflating intellectual with cold, and they're not necessarily the same thing. You know, these movies are definitely intelligent, but I don't think that they are. I'm just going to be profane about it. I don't think they're that far up their own ass in terms of their intelligence.
Yeah.
I walked away from this. I see Christopher Nolan movies, obviously. You know, everybody does. He's a big director. But I wouldn't call myself, I wouldn't have called myself like much of a fan, you know? And I think I walked away with it with less of an emotional reaction than you had. I do think his movies are what's-its, you know, they're devices, they're machines you wind up and let them go a lot of the time. But I gained a lot of respect and appreciation for the storytelling behind that and the skill of the storytelling that makes that happen. And I think that maybe that is the more human element of it that I connected to, as opposed to, you know, say like the theme, you know, like the skill, like I appreciate Christopher Nolan as a storyteller more after doing this. And that's all we've got for you this week, and that concludes our Christopher Nolan series. You can find earlier episodes on our feed if you need to catch up. While you're there, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club, wherever you get your podcasts. But before we go, we also want to let you know about a new AV Club podcast premiering this week called Push the Envelope. On Push the Envelope, AV Club editors and celebrity guests discuss the Emmys, Oscars, Grammys, Golden Globes, and more. From dream nominations to current snubs and surprises to favorite moments from past ceremonies, if someone's handing out trophies, they're talking about it. We'll share their first episode on our feed, but don't forget to subscribe to Push the Envelope, also wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Please join us next week for an all-new episode.
Bye!